One morning, John Sullivan found himself walking along a street downtown. He could not explain what he was doing there, or how he got there, or where he had been earlier. He didn't even know what time it was. He saw a woman walking toward him and stopped her. "I'm afraid I forgot my watch," he said and smiled. "Can you tell me the time?" When she saw him, she screamed and ran. Then John Sullivan noticed that other people were afraid of him. When they saw him coming, they flattened themselves against a building or ran across the street to stay out of his way. There must be something wrong with me, John Sullivan thought. I'd better go home. He hailed a taxi, but the driver took one look at him and sped away. John Sullivan did not understand what was going on, and it scared him. "Maybe somebody at home can come and get me," he thought. He found a telephone and called his wife, but a voice he did not recognize answered. "Is Mrs. Sullivan there?" he asked. "No, she is at a funeral," the voice said. "Mr. Sullivan was killed yesterday in an accident downtown." That's from the book Truly Terrifying Pictures and Some Stories. Let's see what else we have. Oh, okay then. Oh, okay. I thought this was an M.R. James book, but it's not. It said there was the signalman, and I thought that was Charles Dickens. It is. I kind of wanted to read it when I thought it might be M.R. James, and now I've confirmed it's Charles Dickens. I don't really want to do it. Would you like to hear it? It's quite Dickensian. Well, let's see what else there is. Oh dear. Okay, that's a bit long. My apologies. I was hoping there would be more to read in more scary stories to tell in the dark, but I forgot how lame they were. So I'm just trying to find something that's not terribly long. But, what the hey? The signalman it is. Halloa! Sorry. Halloa! Below there! When he heard a voice thus calling to him, he was standing at the door of his box, with a flag in his hand, furled round its short pole. One would have thought, considering the nature of the ground, that he could not have doubted from what quarter the voice came. But instead of looking up to where I stood on the top of the steep cutting nearly over his head, he turned himself about and looked down the line. There was something remarkable in his manner of doing so, though I could not have said for my life what. But I know it was remarkable enough to attract my notice, even though his figure was foreshortened and shadowed down in the deep trench, and mine was high above him, so steeped in the glow of an angry sunset that I had shaded my eyes with my hand before I saw him at all. "Halloa, below!" From looking down the line, he turned himself about again, and raising his eyes, saw my figure high above him. "Is there any path by which I can come down and speak to you?" He looked up at me without replying, and I looked down at him without pressing him too soon with a repetition of my idle question. Just then there came a vague vibration in the earth and air, quickly changing into a violent pulsation, and an oncoming rush that caused me to start back as though it had force to draw me down. When such vapor as rose to my height from this rapid train had passed me and was skimming away over the landscape, I looked down again and saw him refurling the flag he had shown while the train went by. I repeated my inquiry. After a pause, during which he seemed to regard me with fixed attention, he motioned with his rolled-up flag towards a point on my level some 200 or 300 yards distant. I called down to him, "All right," and made for that point. There, by dint of looking closely about me, I found a rough zigzag descending path notched out, which I followed. The cutting was extremely deep and unusually precipitate. It was made through a clammy stone that became oozier and wetter as I went down. For these reasons, I found the way long enough to give me time to recall a singular air of reluctance or compulsion with which he had pointed out the path. When I came down low enough upon the zigzag descent to see him again, I saw that he was standing between the rails on the way by which the train had lately passed, in an attitude as if he were waiting for me to appear. He had his left hand at his chin, and that left elbow rested on his right hand crossed over his breast. His attitude was one of such expectation and watchfulness that I stopped a moment, wondering at it. I resumed my downward way, and stepping out upon the level of the railroad and drawing nearer to him, saw that he was a dark, sallow man, with a dark beard and rather heavy eyebrows. His post was in as solitary and dismal a place as I ever saw. On either side a dripping wet wall of jagged stone excluding all view but a strip of sky, the perspective one way only a crooked prolongation of this great dungeon, the shorter perspective in the other direction, terminating in a gloomy red light and the gloomier entrance to a black tunnel, in whose massive architecture there was a barbarous, depressing, and forbidding air. So little sunlight ever found its way to this spot that it had an earthly, deadly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it that it struck chill to me, as if I had left the natural world. Before he stirred, I was near enough to him to have touched him. Not even then removing his eyes from mine, he stepped back one step and lifted his hand. This was a lonesome post to occupy, I said, and it had riveted my attention then when I looked down from up yonder. A visitor was a rarity, I should suppose. Not an unwelcome rarity, I hoped. In me he merely saw a man who had been shut up within narrow limits all his life, and who, being at last set free, had a newly awakened interest in these great works. To such purpose I spoke to him, But I am far from sure of the terms I used, for besides that I am not happy in opening any conversation, there was something in the man that daunted me. He directed a most curious look towards the red light near the tunnel's mouth, and looked all about it as if something were missing from it, and then looked at me. That light was part of his charge, was it not? He answered in a low voice, "Don't you know it is?" The monstrous thought came into my mind as I perused the fixed eyes and the saturnine face, that this was a spirit, not a man. I have speculated since whether there may have been infection in his mind. In my turn I stepped back, but in making the action I detected in his eyes some latent fear of me. This put the monstrous thought to flight. "You look at me," I said, forcing a smile, "as if you had a dread of me." "I was doubtful," he returned, "whether I had seen you before." "Where?" He pointed to the red light he had looked at. "There?" I said. Intently watchful of me, he replied, but without sound, "Yes." "My good fellow, what should I do there? However, be that as it may, I never was there, you may swear." "I think I may," he rejoined. "Yes, I am sure I may." His manner cleared, like my own. He replied to my remarks with readiness and in well-chosen words. Had he much to do there? Yes. That was to say, he had enough responsibility to bear, but exactness and watchfulness were what was required of him, and of actual work, manual labor, he had next to none. To change that signal, to trim those lights, and to turn this iron handle now and then, was all he had to do under the head. Regarding those many long and lonely hours of which I seemed to make so much, he could only say that the routine of his life had shaped itself into that form, and he had grown used to it. He had taught himself a language down here, if only to know it by sight, and to have formed his own crude ideas of its pronunciation could be called learning it. He had also worked at fractions and decimals and tried a little algebra. But he was, and had been as a boy, a poor hand at figures. Was it necessary for him, when on duty, always to remain in that channel of damp air? And could he never rise into the sunshine from between those high stone walls? Why, that depended upon the times and circumstances. Under some conditions, there would be less upon the line than under others, and the same held good as to certain hours of the day and night. In bright weather, he did choose occasions for getting a little above these lower shadows, but being at all times liable to be called by his electric bell, and at such times listening for it with redoubled anxiety, the relief was less than I would suppose. He took me into his box, where there was a fire, a desk for an official book in which he had to make certain entries, a telegraphic instrument with its dial face and needles, and the little bell of which he had spoken. On my trusting that he would excuse a remark that he had been well educated, and, I hoped I might say without offense, perhaps educated above that station, he observed that instances of slight incongruity in such wise would rarely be found wanting among large bodies of men. That he had heard it was so in workhouses, in the police force, even in that last desperate resource, the army, and that he knew it was so more or less in any great railway staff. He had been, when young, if I could believe it, sitting in that hut, he scarcely could, a student of natural philosophy, and had attended lectures, but he had run wild, misused his opportunities, gone down, and never risen again. He had no complaint to offer about that. He had made his bed, and he lay upon it. It was far too late to make another. "All that I have here condensed," he said in a quiet manner, with his grave, dark regards divided between me and the fire. He threw in the word "sir" from time to time, and especially when he referred to his youth, as though to request me to understand that he claimed to be nothing but what I found him. He was several times interrupted by the little bell, and had to read off messages and send replies. Once he had to stand without the door and display a flag as a train passed, and make some verbal communication to the driver. In the discharge of his duties, I observed him to be remarkably exact and vigilant, breaking off his discourse at a syllable, and remaining silent until what he had to do was done. In a word, I should have set this man down as one of the safest of men to be employed in that capacity, but for the circumstance that while he was speaking to me, he twice broke off with a fallen color, turned his face toward the little bell when it did not ring, opened the door of the hut which was kept shut to exclude the unhealthy damp, and looked out towards the red light near the mouth of the tunnel. On both of those occasions, he came back to the fire with the inexplicable air upon him which I had remarked, without being able to define when we were so far asunder. Said I, when I rose to leave him, "You almost make me think that I have met with a contented man." I am afraid I must acknowledge that I said it to lead him on. "I believe I used to be so," he rejoined, in the low voice in which he had first spoken. "But I am troubled, sir. I am troubled." He would have recalled the words if he could. He had said them, however, and I took them up quickly. "With what? What is your trouble?" "It is very difficult to impart, sir. It is very, very difficult to speak of. If ever you make me another visit, I will try to tell you." "But I expressly intend to make you another visit. Say, when shall it be?" "I go off early in the morning, and I shall be on again at 10 tomorrow night, sir." "I will come at 11. He thanked me, and went out the door with me. "I'll show you my white light, sir," he said in his peculiar low voice, "till you have found the way up. When you have found it, don't call out. And when you are at the top, don't call out." His manner seemed to make the place strike colder to me, but I said no more than, "Very well." "And when you come down tomorrow night, don't call out. Let me ask you a parting question. What made you cry, 'Halloa, below there,' tonight?" "Heaven knows," said I. "I cried something to that effect." "Not to that effect, sir. Those were the very words. I know them well." "Admit those were the very words." "I said them, no doubt, because I saw you below." "For no other reason?" "What other reason could I possibly have?" "You had no feeling that they were conveyed to you in any supernatural way?" "No." He wished me good night, and held up his light. I walked by the side of the down line of rails with a very disagreeable sensation of a train coming behind me, until I found the path. It was easier to mount than to descend, and I got back to my inn without any adventure. Punctual to my appointment, I placed my foot on the first notch of the zigzag next night, as the distant clocks were striking 11. He was waiting for me at the bottom, with his white light on. "I have not called out," I said, when we came close together. "May I speak now?" "By all means, sir." "Good night, then, and here's my hand." "Good night, sir, and here is mine." With that, we walked side by side to his box, entered it, closed the door, and sat down by the fire. I have made up my mind, sir, he began, bending forward as soon as we were seated, and speaking in a tone but a little above a whisper, that you shall not have to ask me twice what troubles me. I took you for someone else yesterday evening. That troubles me. That mistake? No. That's someone else. Who is it? I don't know. Like me? I don't know. I never saw the face. The left arm is across the face, and the right arm is waved. Violently waved. This way. I followed his action with my eyes, and it was the action of an arm gesticulating with the utmost passion and vehemence. For God's sake, clear the way. One moonlit night, said the man, I was sitting here when I heard a voice cry, "Halloa, below there." I started up, looked from that door, and saw this someone else standing by the red light near the tunnel, waving as I just now showed you. The voice seemed hoarse without shouting, and it cried, "Look out! Look out!" And then again, "Halloa, below there! Look out!" I caught up my lamp, turned it on red, and ran towards the figure, calling, "What's wrong? What has happened? Where?" It stood just outside the blackness of the tunnel. I advanced so close upon it that I wondered at its keeping the sleeve across its eyes. I ran right up at it, and had my hand stretched out to pull the sleeve away, when it was gone. "Into the tunnel," said I. No. I ran on into the tunnel, 500 yards. I stopped and held my lamp above my head, and saw the figures of the measured distance, and saw the wet stains stealing down the walls and trickling through the arch. I ran out again, faster than I had run in, for I had a mortal abhorrence of the place upon me, and I looked all around the red light with my own red light. And I went up the iron ladder to the galley, to the gallery atop of it. And I came down again and ran back here. I telegraphed both ways. An alarm has been given. Is anything wrong? The answer came back both ways. All well. Resisting the slow touch of a frozen finger tracing out my spine, I showed him how that this figure must be a deception of his sense of sight, and how that figures originating in disease of the delicate nerves that minister to the functions of the eye were known to have often troubled patients, some of whom had become conscious of the nature of their affliction, and had been proved it by experiments upon themselves. As to an imaginary cry, said I, do but listen for a moment to the wind in this unnatural valley while we speak so low, and to the wild harp it makes of the telegraph wires. That was all very well, he returned, after we had sat listening for a while, and he ought to know something of the wind and the wires, he who so often passed long winter nights there alone and watching. But he would beg to remark that he had not finished. I asked his pardon, and he slowly added these words, touching my arm. Within 6 hours after the appearance, the memorable accident on this line happened. And within 10 hours, the dead and wounded were brought along through the tunnel over the spot where the figure had stood. A disagreeable shudder crept over me, but I did my best against it. It was not to be denied, I rejoined, that this was a remarkable coincidence, calculated deeply to impress his mind. But it was unquestionable that remarkable coincidences did continually occur, and they must be taken into account in dealing with such a subject. Though to be sure, I must admit, I added, for I thought I saw that he was going to bring the objection to bear upon me, men of common sense did not allow much for coincidences in making the ordinary calculations of life. He again begged to remark that he had not finished. I again begged his pardon for being betrayed into interruptions. This, he said, again laying his hand upon my arm and glancing over his shoulder with hollow eyes, was just a year ago. 6 or 7 months passed, and I had recovered from the surprise and shock, when one morning, as the day was breaking, I, standing at that door, looked towards the red light and saw the spectre again. He stopped with a fixed look at me. Did it cry out? No, it was silent. Did it wave its arm? No. It leaned against the shaft of the light, with both hands before the face, like this. Once more I followed his action with my eyes. It was an action of mourning. I have seen such an attitude in stone figures on tombs. Did you go up to it? I came and sat down, partly to collect my thoughts, partly because it had turned me faint. When I went to the door again, daylight was above me, and the ghost was gone. But nothing followed? Nothing came of this? He touched me on the arm with his forefinger twice or thrice, giving a ghastly nod each time. That very day, as a train came out of the tunnel, I noticed, at a carriage window on my side, what looked like a confusion of hands and heads, and something waved. I saw just in time to signal the driver, "Stop." He shut off and put his brake on, but the train drifted past here 150 yards or more. I ran after it, and as I went along, heard terrible screams and cries. A beautiful young lady had died instantaneously in one of the compartments, and was brought in here, and laid down on this floor between us. Involuntarily, I pushed my chair back, as I looked from the boards at which he pointed, to himself. True, sir, true. Precisely as it happened, so I tell it to you. I could think of nothing to say, to any purpose, and my mouth was very dry. The wind and the wires took up the story with a long lamenting wail. He resumed. Now, sir, mark this, and judge how my mind is troubled. The spectre came back a week ago. Ever since it has been here, now and again by fits and starts. At the light? At the danger light. What does it seem to do? He repeated, if possible, with increased passion and vehemence, that form of gesticulation of, "For God's sake, clear the way." Then he went on, I have no peace or rest for it. It calls to me for many minutes together in an agonized manner. Below there, look out, look out! It stands waving to me. It rings my little bell. I caught at that. Did it ring your bell yesterday evening when I was here and you went to the door? Twice. Why, see, said I, how your imagination misleads you. My eyes were on the bell, and my ears were open to the bell, and if I'm a living man, it did not ring at those times. No, nor at any other time, except when it was rung in the natural course of physical things by the station communicating with you. He shook his head. I have never made a mistake as to that yet, sir. I have never confused the spectre's ring with the man's. The ghost's ring is a strange vibration in the bell that it derives from nothing else. And I have not asserted that the bell stirs to the eye. I don't wonder that you failed to hear it, but I hear it. And did the spectre seem to be there when you looked out? It was there. Both times? He repeated firmly, both times. Will you come to the door with me and look for it now? He bit his underlip as though he were somewhat unwilling, but arose. I opened the door and stood on the step while he stood in the doorway. There was the danger light. There was the dismal mouth of the tunnel. There were the high wet stone walls of the cutting. There were the stars above them. Do you see it? I asked him, taking particular note of his face. His eyes were prominent and strained, but not very much more so, perhaps, than my own had been when I had directed them earnestly towards the same spot. No, he answered, it is not there. Agreed, said I. We went in again, shut the door, and resumed our seats. I was thinking how best to improve this advantage, if it might be called one, when he took up the conversation in such a matter-of-course way, so assuming that there could be no serious question of fact between us, that I felt myself placed in the weakest of positions. By this time, you will fully understand, sir, he said, that what troubles me so dreadfully is the question, what does the spectre mean? I was not sure, I told him, that I did fully understand. What is its warning against? He said, ruminating, with his eyes on the fire and only by times turning them on me. What is the danger? Where is the danger? There is danger overhanging somewhere on the line. Some dreadful calamity will happen. It is not to be doubted this third time, after what has gone before. But surely this is cruel haunting of me. What can I do? He pulled out his handkerchief and wiped the drops from his heated forehead. If I telegraph danger on either side of me, or on both, I can give no reason for it, he went on, wiping the palms of his hands. I should get into trouble and do no good. They would think I was mad. This is the way it would work. Message. Danger. Take care. Answer. What danger? Where? Message. Don't know, but for God's sake, take care. They would displace me. What else could they do? His pain of mind was most pitiable to see. It was the mental torture of a conscientious man, oppressed beyond endurance by an unintelligible responsibility involving life. When it first stood under the danger light, he went on, putting his dark hair back from his head and drawing his hands outward across and across his temples, in an extremity of feverish distress. "Why not tell me where that accident was to happen, if it must happen? Why not tell me how it could be averted, if it could have been averted? When on its second coming it hit its face, why not tell me instead, she is going to die? Let them keep her at home. If it came on those 2 occasions, only to show me that its warnings were true, and so to prepare me for the third, why not warn me plainly now? And I, Lord help me, a mere poor signalman on this solitary station, why not go to somebody with credit to be believed, and power to act?" When I saw him in this state, I saw that for the poor man's sake, as well as for the public safety, what I had to do for the time was to compose his mind. Therefore, setting aside all question of reality or unreality between us, I represented to him that whoever thoroughly discharged his duty must do well, and that at least it was his comfort that he understood his duty, though he did not understand these confounding appearances. In this effort I succeeded far better than in the attempt to reason him out of his conviction. He became calm. The occupations incidental to his post as the night advanced began to make larger demands on his attention, and I left him at 2 in the morning. I had offered to stay through the night, but he would not hear of it. That I more than once looked back at the red light as I ascended the pathway, that I did not like the red light, and that I should have slept but poorly if my bed had been under it, I see no reason to conceal. Nor did I like the 2 sequences of the accident and the dead girl. I see no reason to conceal that either. But what ran most in my thoughts was a consideration how ought I to act, having become the recipient of this disclosure. I had proved the man to be intelligent, vigilant, painstaking, and exact. But how light or how long might he remain so in his state of mind? Though in a subordinate position, still he held a most important trust, and would I, for instance, like to stake my own life on the chances of his continuing to execute it with precision? Unable to overcome a feeling that there would be something treacherous in my communicating what he had told me to his superiors in the company, without first being plain with himself and proposing a middle course to him, I ultimately resolved to offer to accompany him, otherwise keeping his secret for the present, to the wisest medical practitioner we could hear of in those parts, and to take his opinion. A change in his time of duty would come round next night. He had apprised me, and he would be off an hour or 2 after sunrise, and on again soon after sunset. I had appointed to return accordingly. Next evening was a lovely evening, and I walked out early to enjoy it. The sun was not yet quite down when I traversed the field path near the top of the deep cutting. I would extend my walk for an hour, I said to myself, half an hour on and half an hour back, and it would then be time to go to my signalman's box. Before pursuing my stroll, I stepped to the brink, and mechanically looked down from the point from which I had first seen him. I cannot describe the thrill that seized upon me when, close at the mouth of the tunnel, I saw the appearance of a man, with his left sleeve across his eyes, passionately waving his right arm. The nameless horror that oppressed me passed in a moment, for in a moment I saw that this appearance of a man was a man indeed, and that there was a little group of other men standing at a short distance, to whom he seemed to be rehearsing the gesture he made. The danger light was not yet lighted. Against its shaft A little low hut, entirely new to me, had been made of some wooden supports and tarpaulin. It looked no bigger than a bed. With an irresistible sense that something was wrong, with a flashing self-reproachful fear that fatal mischief had come of my leaving the man there, and causing no one to be sent to overlook or correct what he did, I descended the notched path with all the speed I could make. "What is the matter?" I asked the men. "Signalman killed this morning, sir." "Not the man belonging to the box?" "Yes, sir." "Not the man I know?" "You will recognize him, sir, if you knew him," said the man who spoke for the others, solemnly uncovering his own head and raising an end of the tarpaulin. "For his face is quite composed." "Oh, how did this happen? How did this happen?" I asked, turning from one to another as the hut closed in again. "He was cut down by an Injun, sir. No man in England knew his work better. But somehow he was not clear of the outer rail. He was just at broad day. He had struck the light and had the lamp in his hand. As the engine came out of the tunnel, his back was towards her, and she cut him down. That man drove her and was showing how it happened. Show the gentleman, Tom." The man, who wore a rough dark dress, stepped back to his former place at the mouth of the tunnel. "Coming round the curve in the tunnel, sir," he said. "I saw him at the end, like as if I saw him down in a perspective glass. There was no time to check speed, and I knew him to be very careful. As he didn't seem to take heed of the whistle, I shut it off when we were running down upon him, and called to him as loud as I could call." "What did you say?" "I said, 'Below there! Look out! Look out! For God's sake, clear the way!'" I started. It was a dreadful time, sir. I never left off calling to him. I put this arm before my eyes, not to see, and I waved this arm to the last, but it was no use." Without prolonging the narrative to dwell on any one of its curious circumstances more than on any other, I may, in closing it, point out the coincidence that the warning of the engine driver included not only the words which the unfortunate signalman had repeated to me as haunting him, but also the words which I myself, not he, had attached, and that only in my own mind, to the gesticulation he had imitated. Pardon my silence. I do take the medicine. Well, you can't be ambiguous when you talk about medicine. I had to take an allergy pill so that I wouldn't be sniffing in the microphone. I had to take the medicine that would make my reading come out better. And then I thought that could be anything more interesting than generic Benadryl. Not that I think I'll be going on that long, but you never know. And hell, it'll help me sleep, I suppose. Now if I can... Oh my, this light is ghastly. If only I had a candle. Well, this is rather dark. Good thing to have the lit phone screen showing the words to me, but when it's actual text, well then. Oh dear. Oh dear. Oh yeah. My apologies. In my terrible, uncouth unprofessionalism. How dare I? Okay, can you hear me, children and adults? Terribly, terribly old adults. How are you doing? Are we all well? Would you like to hear one of my favorite stories? I will tell it. It'll be the last one of the evening. Unless you want to hear what... Where did my... Oh. I want to put one quick, scary story to tell in the dark. In between something... Well, they're all short, I suppose. Something to butter up the nipples. I mean, Oh, well, this should be appropriate. Right. Fred and Jean went to the same high school, but they met for the first time at the Christmas dance. Fred had come by himself, and so had Jean. Soon Fred decided that Jean was one of the nicest girls he had ever met. They danced together most of the evening. At 11 o'clock, Jean said, "I have to leave now. Can you give me a ride?" "Sure," he said. "I've got to go home too." "I accidentally drove my car into a tree on my way over here," Jean said. "I guess I wasn't paying attention." Fred drove her to the head of Brady Road. It was in a neighborhood he didn't know very well. "Why don't you drop me off here?" Jean said. "The road up ahead is in really bad condition. I can walk from here." Fred stopped the car and held out some tinsel. "Have some," he said. "I got it at the dance." "Thank you," she said. "I'll put it in my hair." And she did. "Would you like to go out sometime to a movie or something?" Fred asked. "That would be fun," Jean said. After Fred drove off, he realized that he did not know Jean's last name or her telephone number. "I'll go back," he thought. "The road can't be that bad." He drove slowly down Brady Road, through a thick woods, but there wasn't a sign of Jean. As he came around a curve, he saw the wreckage of a car ahead. It had crashed into a tree and had caught fire. Smoke was still rising from it. As Fred made his way to the car, he could see someone trapped inside, crushed against the steering column. It was Jean. In her hair was the Christmas tinsel he had given her. Yeah, that's awful. it's the woods. Right. Let's get on with it. I suppose as my voice goes, every 10 pages or so I'll need to take a drink, so I apologize if I have to pause for that. Let us begin. 1. Am I loud enough? Oh, I hit the red on that. But am I loud enough when I... Hello. 1. Mike Inslin was still in the revolving door when he saw Olin, the manager of the Hotel Dolphin, sitting in one of the overstuffed lobby chairs. Mike's heart sank. Maybe I should have brought the lawyer along again after all, he thought. Well, too late now, and even if Olin had decided to throw up another roadblock or two between Mike and room 1408, that wasn't all bad. There were compensations. Olin was crossing the room with one pudgy hand held out as Mike left the revolving door. The Dolphin was on 61st Street, around the corner from Fifth Avenue, small but smart. A man and a woman dressed in evening clothes passed Mike as he reached for Olin's hand, switching his small overnight case to his left hand in order to do it. The woman was blonde, dressed in black, of course, and the light, flowery smell of her perfume seemed to summarize New York. On the mezzanine level, someone was playing Night and Day in the bar, as if to underline the summary. Mr. Inslin, good evening. Mr. Olin, is there a problem? Olin looked pained. For a moment, he glanced around the small, smart lobby as if for help. At the concierge's stand, a man was discussing theater tickets with his wife while the concierge himself watched them with small, patient smile. At the front desk, a man with the rumpled look one only got after long hours in business class was discussing his reservation with a woman in a smart black suit that could itself have doubled for evening wear. It was business as usual at the Hotel Dolphin. There was help for everyone except for poor Mr. Olin, who had fallen into the writer's clutches. Mr. Olin? Mike repeated. Mr. Inslin. Could I speak to you for a moment in my office? Well, and why not? It would help the section on room 1408, add to the ominous tone the readers of his books seemed to crave. And that wasn't all. Mike Inslin hadn't been sure until now, in spite of all the backing and filling. Now he was. Olin was really afraid of room 1408. And of what might happen to Mike there tonight. Of course, Mr. Olin. Olin, the good host, reached for Mike's bag. Allow me. I'm fine with it, Mike said. Nothing but a change of clothes and a toothbrush. Are you sure? Yes, Mike said. I'm already wearing my Lucky Hawaiian shirt. He smiled. It's the one with the ghost repellent. Olin didn't smile back. He sighed instead, a little round man in a dark cutaway coat and a neatly knotted tie. Very good, Mr. Inslin. Follow me. The hotel manager had seemed tentative in the lobby, almost beaten. In his oak-paneled office, with the pictures of the hotel on the walls the Dolphin had opened in 1910, Mike might publish without the benefit of reviews in the journals or the big city papers, but he did his research. Olin seemed to gain reassurance again. There was a Persian carpet on the floor. 2 standing lamps cast a mild yellow light. A desk lamp with a green lozenge-shaped shade stood on the desk, next to a humidor. And next to the humidor were Mike Insland's last 3 books. Paperback editions, of course. There had been no hardbacks. Mine host has been doing a little research of his own, Mike thought. Mike sat down in front of the desk. He expected Olin to sit behind the desk, but Olin surprised him. He took the chair beside Mike's, crossed his legs, then leaned forward over his tidy little belly to touch the humidor. "Cigar, Mr. Insland?" "No, thank you. I don't smoke." Olin's eyes shifted to the cigarette behind Mike's right ear, parked on a jaunty jut the way an old-time wisecracking reporter might have parked his next smoke just below the press tag stuck in the band of his fedora. The cigarette had become so much a part of him that for a moment Mike honestly didn't know what Olin was looking at. Then he laughed, took it down, looked at himself, and looked back at Olin. "I haven't had one in 9 years, he said. "Had an older brother who died of lung cancer. I quit after he died. The cigarette behind the ear," he shrugged. "Part affection, part superstition, I guess. Like the Hawaiian shirt, or the cigarettes you sometimes see on people's desks or walls, mounted in a little box with a sign saying, 'Break glass in case of emergency.' Is 1408 a smoking room, Mr. Olin? Just in case nuclear war breaks out?" "As a matter of fact, it is." "Well," Mike said heartily, "that's one less worry in the watches of the night." Mr. Olin sighed again, but this sigh did not have the disconsolate quality of his lobby sigh. Yes, it was the office, Mike reckoned. Olin's office, his special place. Even this afternoon, when Mike had come accompanied by Robertson, the lawyer, Olin had seemed less flustered once they were in here. And why not? Where else could you feel in charge if not in your special place? Olin's office was a room with good pictures on the walls, a good rug on the floor, and good cigars in the humidor. A lot of managers had no doubt conducted a lot of business in here since 1910. In its own way, it was as New York as the blonde in her black off-the-shoulder dress, her smell of perfume, and her unarticulated promise of sleek New York sex in the small hours of the morning. "You still don't think I can talk you out of this idea of yours, do you?" Olin asked. "I know you can't," Mike said, replacing the cigarette behind his ear. He didn't slick his hair back with Vitalis or Wildroot cream oil, as those colorful fedora-wearing scribblers of yore had, but he still changed the cigarette every day, just as he changed his underwear. "You sweat back there behind your ears." If he examined the cigarette at the end of the day before throwing its unsmoked deadly length into the toilet, Mike could see the faint yellow-orange residue of that sweat on the thin white paper. It did not increase the temptation to light up. How he had smoked for almost 20 years, 30 butts a day, sometimes 40, was now beyond him. Why he had done it was an even better question. Olin picked up the little stack of paperbacks by the blotter. "I sincerely hope you're wrong." Mike ran open the zipper on the side pocket of his overnight bag. He brought out a Sony mini-recorder. "Would you mind if I taped our conversation, Mr. Olin?" Olin waved a hand. Mike pushed record and the little red light came on. The reels began to turn. Olin, meanwhile, was shuffling slowly through the stack of books, reading the titles. As always, when he saw his books in someone else's hands, Mike Insland felt the oddest mix of emotions. Pride, unease, amusement, defiance, and shame. He had no business feeling ashamed of them. They had kept him nicely over these last 5 years, and he didn't have to share any of the profits with a packager. Book whores is what his agent called them, perhaps partly in envy, because he had come up with the concept himself. Although after the first book had sold so well, only a moron could have missed the concept. What was there to do after Frankenstein but Bride of Frankenstein? Still, he had gone to Iowa. He had studied with Jane Smiley. He had once been on a panel with Stanley Elkin. he had once aspired. Absolutely no one in his current circle of friends or acquaintances had any least inkling of this, to be published at a Yale Younger Poet. And when the hotel manager began speaking the titles aloud, Mike found himself wishing he had not challenged Olin with the recorder. Later, he would listen to Olin's measured tones and imagine he had heard contempt in them. He touched the cigarette behind his ear without being aware of it. 10 nights in 10 haunted houses, Olin read. 10 nights in 10 haunted graveyards. 10 nights in 10 haunted castles. He looked up at Mike with a faint smile at the corners of his mouth. Got to Scotland on that one. Not to mention the Vienna Woods. And all tax-deductible, correct? Hauntings are, after all, your business. Do you have a point? You're sensitive about these, aren't you? Olin asked. Sensitive, yes. Vulnerable, no. If you're open to persuade me out of your hotel by critiquing my books. No, not at all. I was curious, that's all. I sent Marcel, he's the concierge on days, out to get them 2 days ago, when you first appeared with your request. It was a demand, not a request. Still is. You heard Mr. Robertson. New York state law, not to mention 2 federal civil rights laws, forbids you to deny me a specific room. If I request that specific room and the room is vacant, and 1408 is vacant, 1408 is always vacant these days. But Mr. Olin was not to be diverted from the subject of Mike's last 3 books, New York Times bestsellers all, just yet. He simply shuffled through them a 3rd time. The mellow lamplight reflected off their shiny covers. There was a lot of purple on the covers. Purple sold scary books better than any other color, Mike had been told. I didn't get a chance to dip into these until earlier this evening, Olin said. I've been quite busy. I usually am. The Dolphin is small by New York standards, but we run at a 90% occupancy, and usually a problem comes through the front door with every guest. Like me? Olin smiled a little. I'd say you're a bit of a special problem, Mr. Enslin. You and your Mr. Robertson and all your threats. Mike felt nettled all over again. He had made no threats, unless Robertson himself was a threat. And he had been forced to use the lawyer as a man might be forced to use a crowbar on a rusty lockbox, which would no longer accept the key. The lockbox isn't yours, a voice inside told him. But the laws of the state and the country said differently. The laws said that room 1408 in the Hotel Dolphin was his if he wanted it, and as long as no one else had it first. He became aware that Olin was watching him, still with that faint smile, as if he had been following Mike's interior dialogue, almost word for word. It was an uncomfortable feeling, and Mike was finding this an unexpectedly uncomfortable meeting. It felt as if he had been on the defensive ever since he had taken out the mini-corder, which was usually intimidating, and turned it on. If any of this has a point, Mr. Olin, I'm afraid I lost sight of it a turn or 2 back. And I've had a long day. If your wrangle over room 1408 is really over, I'd like to go upstairs and... I read one. What would you call them? Essays? Tales? Bill payers was what Mike called them, but he didn't intend to say that while the tape was running. Not even though it was his tape. Story, Olin decided. I read one story from each book. The one about the Rilsby house in Kansas from your Haunted Houses book. Ah, yes, the axe murders. The fellow who had chopped up all the 6 members of the Eugene Rilsby family had never been caught. Exactly so.
And the one about the night you spent camped out on the graves of the lovers in Alaska who committed suicide. The ones people keep claiming to see around Sitka. And the account of your night in Gartsby Castle. That was actually quite amusing. I was surprised.
Mike's ear was carefully tuned to catch the undernotes of contempt and even the blandest comments about his 10 Nights books, and he had no doubt that he sometimes heard contempt that wasn't there. Few creatures on earth are so paranoid as the writer who believes deep in his heart that he is slumming. Mike had discovered, but he didn't believe there was any contempt here. "Thank you," he said. "I guess." He glanced down at his mini-quarter. Usually his little red eye seemed to be watching the other guy, daring him to say the wrong thing. This evening it seemed to be looking at Mike himself.
"Oh, yes, I meant that as a compliment."
Olin tapped the books.
"I expect to finish these. But for the writing. It's the writing I like. I was surprised to find myself laughing at your quite unsupernatural adventures in Gartsby Castle. And I was surprised to find you as good as you are, as subtle as you are. I expected more hack and slash."
Mike steeled himself for what would almost certainly come next. Olin's variation of, "What's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?" Olin, the urbane hotelier, host to blonde women who wore black dresses out into the night, hirer of weedy, retiring men who wore tuxes and tinkled old standards like Night and Day and the hotel bar. Olin, who probably read Proust on his nights off.
But they are disturbing, too, these books. If I hadn't looked at them, I don't think I would have bothered waiting for you this evening. Once I saw the lawyer with his briefcase, I knew you meant to stay in that goddamned room, and that nothing I could say was apt to dissuade you. But the books...
Mike reached out and snapped off the mini-quarter. That little red staring eye was starting to give him the willies. "Do you want to know why I'm bottom feeding? Is that it?"
"I assume you do it for the money,"
Olin said mildly.
"And you're feeding a long way from the bottom, at least in my estimation. Although it's interesting that you would jump so nimbly at such a conclusion."
Mike felt warmth rising in his cheeks. No, this wasn't going the way he had expected at all. He had never snapped his recorder off in the middle of a conversation. But Olin wasn't what he had seemed. I was led astray by his hands, Mike thought. Those pudgy little hotel manager's hands with their neat white crescents of manicured nail.
What concerned me, what frightened me, is that I found myself reading the work of an intelligent, talented man who doesn't believe one single thing he has written.
That wasn't exactly true, Mike thought. He'd written perhaps 24 stories he believed in, had actually published a few. He'd written reams of poetry he believed in during his first 18 months in New York, when he had starved on the payroll of the Village Voice. But did he believe that the headless ghost of Eugene Reelsby walked his deserted Kansas farmhouse by moonlight? No. He had spent the night in that farmhouse, camped out on the dirty linoleum hills of the kitchen floor, and had seen nothing scarier than 2 mice trundling along the baseboard. He had spent a hot summer night in the ruins of the Transylvanian castle where Vlad Tepes supposedly still held court. The only vampires to actually show up had been a fog of European mosquitoes. During the night camped out by the grave of serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, a white blood-streaked figure waving a knife had come at him out of the 2 o'clock darkness. But the giggles of the apparition's friends had given him away, and Mike Enslin hadn't been terribly impressed anyway. He knew a teenage ghost waving a rubber knife when he saw one, but he had no intention of telling any of this to Olin. He couldn't afford, except he could. The mini-quarter, a mistake from the get-go, he now understood, was stowed away again, and this meeting was about as off the record as you could get. Also, he had come to admire Olin in a weird way, and when you admired a man, you wanted to tell him the truth. "No," he said, "I don't believe in ghoulies and ghosties and long-leggedy beasties. I think it's good that there's no such things, because I don't believe there's any good Lord that can protect us from them either. That's what I believe, but I've kept an open mind from the very start. I may never win the Pulitzer Prize for investigating the barking ghost in Mount Hope Cemetery, but I would have written fairly about him if he'd shown up." Olin said something, only a single word, but too low for Mike to make it out. "I beg pardon?"
"I said no."
Olin looked at him almost apologetically. Mike sighed. Olin thought he was a liar. When you got to the point, the only choices were to put up your dukes or disengage totally from the discussion. "Why don't we leave this for another day, Mr. Olin? I'll just go upstairs, brush my teeth. Perhaps I'll see Kevin O'Malley materialize behind me in the bathroom window, or mirror." Mike started to get out of his chair, and Olin put out one of his pudgy, carefully manicured hands to stop him.
"I'm not calling you a liar," he said. "But Mr. Inslin, you don't believe. Ghosts rarely appear to those who don't believe in them, and when they do, they are rarely seen. Why, Eugene Reelsby could have bowled his severed head all the way down the front hall of his home, and you wouldn't have heard a thing."
Mike stood up, then bent to grab his overnight case. "If that's so, I won't have anything to worry about in room 1408, will I?"
"But you will," Olin said. "You will. Because there are no ghosts in room 1408 and never have been. There's something in there. I felt it myself. But it's not a spirit presence. In an abandoned house or an old castle keep, your unbelief may serve as your protection. In room 1408, it will only render you more vulnerable. Don't do it, Mr. Inslin. That's why I waited for you tonight to ask you, to beg you, not to do it. Of all the people on Earth who don't belong in that room, the man who wrote these cheerful, exploitative true ghost books leads the list."
Mike heard this and didn't hear it at the same time. "And you turned off your tape recorder," he was raving. "He embarrasses me into turning off my tape recorder, and then he turns into Boris goddamn Karloff hosting the All-Star Spook Weekend. Fuck it! I'll quote him anyway. If he doesn't like it, let him sue me." All at once, he was burning to get upstairs. Not just so he could start getting his long night in a corner hotel room over with, but because he wanted to transcribe what Olin had just said while it was still fresh in his mind.
"Have a drink, Mr. Inslin."
"No, I really..." Mr. Olin reached into his coat pocket and brought out a key on a long brass paddle. The brass looked old and scratched and tarnished. Embossed on it were the numbers 1408.
"Please," Olin said, "humor me. You give me 10 more minutes of your time, long enough to consume a short scotch, and I'll hand you this key. I would give almost anything to be able to change your mind, but I like to think I can recognize the inevitable when I see it."
"You still actually use keys here?" Mike asked. "Sort of a nice touch. Antique-y."
"The Dolphin went to a mag card system in 1979, Mr. Inslin. The year I took the job as manager. 1408 is the only room in the house that still opens with a key. There was no need to put a maglock card on its door, because there's never anyone inside. The room was last occupied by a paying guest in 1978.
"You're shitting me." Mike sat down again and unlimbered his mini-quarter again. He pushed the record button and said, "House manager Olin claims 1408 not rented to a paying guest in over 20 years.
It is just as well that 1408 has never needed a mag card lock on its door, because I am completely positive the device wouldn't work. Digital wristwatches won't work in room 1408. Sometimes they run backwards, sometimes they simply go out, but you can't tell time with one. Not in room 1408 you can't. The same is true of pocket calculators and cell phones. If you're wearing a beeper, Mr. Enslin, I advise you to turn it off, because once you're in room 1408, it will start beeping at will. He paused. And turning it off isn't guaranteed to work either. It may turn itself back on. The only sure cure is to pull the batteries. He pushed the stop button on the mini-recorder without examining the buttons. Mike supposed he used a similar model for dictating memos. Actually, Mr. Enslin, the only sure cure is to stay the hell out of that room. I can't do that, Mike said, taking his mini-recorder back and stowing it once more. But I think I can take time for that drink. While Olin poured from the fumed oak bar beneath an oil painting of Fifth Avenue at the turn of the century, Mike asked him how, if the room had been continuously unoccupied since 1978, Olin knew that high-tech gadgets didn't work inside. I didn't intend to give you the impression that no one had set foot through the door since 1978, Olin replied. For one thing, there are maids in once a month to give the place a light turn. That means... Mike, who had been working on 10 haunted hotel rooms for about 4 months at that point, said, I know what it means. A light turn in an unoccupied room would include opening the windows to change the air, dusting enough tidy bowl in the can to turn the water briefly blue, a change of the towels, probably not the bed linen, not on a light turn. He wondered if he should have brought his sleeping bag. Crossing the Persian from the bar with their drinks in his hands, Olin seemed to read Mike's thought on his face. The sheets were changed this very afternoon, Mr. Enslin. Why don't you drop that? Just call me Mike. I don't think I'd be comfortable with that, Olin said, handing Mike his drink. Here's to you. And you? Mike lifted his glass, meaning to clink it against Olin's, but Olin pulled his back. No, to you, Mr. Enslin. I insist. Tonight we should both drink to you. You'll need it. Mike sighed, clinked the rim of his glass against the rim of Olin's, and said, To me, you would have been right at home in a horror movie, Mr. Olin. You could have played the gloomy old butler who tries to warn the young married couple away from Castle Doom. Olin sat down. It's a part I haven't had to play often, thank God. Room 1408 isn't listed on any of the websites dealing with paranormal locations or psychic hotspots. That'll change after my book, Mike thought, sipping his drink. And there are no ghost tours with stops at the Hotel Dolphin, although they do tour through the Sherry Netherland, the Plaza, and the Park Lane. We have kept 1408 as quiet as possible. Although, of course, the history has always been there for a researcher who is both lucky and tenacious. Mike allowed himself a small smile. Veronique changed the sheets, Olin said. I accompanied her. You should feel flattered, Mr. Enslin. It's almost like having your night's linen put out by royalty. Veronique and her sister came to the Dolphin as chambermaids in 1971 or 72. V, as we call her, is the Hotel Dolphin's longest-running employee, with at least 6 years' seniority over me. She has since risen to head housekeeper. I'd guess she hadn't changed a sheet in 6 years before today. But she used to do all the turns in 1408, she and her sister, until about 1992. Veronique and Celeste were twins, and the bond between them seemed to make them, how shall I put it, not immune to 1408, but its equal. at least for the short periods of time needed to give the room a light turn.
You're not going to tell me this Veronique's sister died in the room, are you?
No, not at all, Olin said. She left service here around 1988, suffering from ill health, but I don't rule out the idea that 1408 may have played a part in her worsening mental and physical condition.
We seem to have built a rapport here, Mr. Olin. I hope I don't snap it by telling you I find that ridiculous.
Olin laughed. So hard-headed for a student of the airy world.
I owe it to my readers, Mike said blandly.
I suppose I simply could have left 1408 as it is anyway during most of its days and nights, the hotel manager mused. Door locked, lights off, shades drawn to keep the sun from fading the carpet, coverlet pulled up, doorknob, breakfast menu on the bed. But I can't bear to think of the air getting stuffy and old. Like the air in an attic. Can't bear to think of the dust piling up until it's thick and fluffy. What does that make me? Persnickety or downright obsessive?
It makes you a hotel manager.
I suppose. In any case, V and C turned that room very quick, just in and out, until C retired, and V got her first big promotion. After that, I got other maids to do it in pairs, always picking ones who got on well with each other.
Hoping for that bond to withstand the bogies?
Hoping for that bond, yes. And you can make fun of the room 1408 bogies as much as you want, Mr. Enslin, but you'll feel them almost at once. Of that I'm confident. Whatever there is in that room, it's not shy. On many occasions, all that I could manage, I went with the maids to supervise them.
He paused, then added almost reluctantly,
to pull them out, I suppose. If anything really awful started to happen, nothing ever did. There were several who had weeping fits, one who had a laughing fit. I don't know why someone laughing out of control should be more frightening than someone sobbing, but it is. And a number who fainted, nothing too terrible, however. I had time enough over the years to make a few primitive experiments. Beepers and cell phones and such, but nothing too terrible. Thank God.
He paused again, then added in a queer, flat tone.
One of them went blind.
What?
She went blind. Rami Van Gelder, that was. She was dusting the top of the television, and all at once she began to scream. I asked her what was wrong. She dropped her dust rag, put her hands over her eyes, and screamed that she was blind, but that she could see the most awful colors. They went away almost as soon as I got her through the door, and by the time I got her down the hallway to the elevator, her sight had begun to come back.
You're telling me all this just to scare me, Mr. Olin, aren't you? To scare me off?
Indeed I am not. You know the history of the room, beginning with the suicide of its first occupant.
Mike did. Kevin O'Malley, a sewing machine salesman, had taken his life on October 13th, 1910. A leaper who had left a wife and 7 children behind. 4 men and 1 woman have jumped from that room's single window, Mr. Enslin.
3 women and 1 man have overdosed with pills in that room. 2 found in bed, 2 found in the bathroom, 1 in the tub, and 1 sitting slumped on the toilet. A man hanged himself in the closet in 1970.
Henry Storkin, Mike said. That was probably accidental erotic asphyxia.
Perhaps. There was also Randolph Hyde, who slit his wrists and then cut off his genitals for good measure while he was bleeding to death. That one wasn't erotic asphyxiation. The point is, Mr. Enslin, if you can't be swayed from your intention by a record of 12 suicides in 68 years, I doubt if the gasps and fibrillations of a few chambermaids will stop you.
Gasps and fibrillations, that's nice, Mike thought, and wondered if he could steal it for the book.
Few of the pairs who have turned 1408 over the years care to go back more than a few times,
Olin said and finished his drink in a tidy little gulp.
Except for the French twins, V and C.
Mike didn't care much about the maids and their, what did Olin call them, their gasps and fibrillations. He did feel mildly rankled by Olin's enumeration of the suicides, as if Mike was so thick he had missed not the fact of them, but their import. Except really, there was no import. Both Abraham Lincoln and John Kennedy had vice presidents named Johnson. The names Lincoln and Kennedy had the 7 letters, and both Lincoln and Kennedy had been elected in years ending in 60. What did all these coincidences prove? Not a goddamn thing. The suicides will make a wonderful segment for my book, Mike said. But since the tape recorder is off, I can tell you they amount to what a statistician, resource of mine calls the cluster effect.
Charles Dickens calls it the potato effect, Olin said.
I beg your pardon?
When Jacob Marley's ghost first speaks to Scrooge, Scrooge tells him he could be nothing but a blob of mustard or a bit of underdone potato.
Is that supposed to be funny? Mike asked, a trifle coldly.
Nothing about this strikes me as funny, Mr. Ensslin. Nothing at all. Listen very closely, please. V's sister Celeste died of a heart attack. At that point, she was suffering mid-stage Alzheimer's, a disease which struck her very early in life.
Yet her sister is fine and well, according to what you said earlier. An American success story, in fact, as you are yourself, Mr. Olin, from the look of you. Yet you've been in and out of the room 1408 how many times? 100, 200?
For very short periods of time, Olin said. It's perhaps like entering a room filled with poison gas. If one holds one's breath, one may be all right. I see you don't like that comparison. You no doubt find it overwrought, perhaps ridiculous. Yet I believe it's a good one.
He steepled his fingers beneath his chin.
It's also possible that some people react more quickly than more violently to whatever lives in that room, just as some people who go scuba diving are more prone to the bends than others. Over the Dolphin's near century of operation, the hotel staff has grown ever more aware that 1408 is a poisoned room. It has become part of the house history, Mr. Ensslin. No one talks about it, just as no one mentions the fact that here, as in most hotels, the 14th floor is actually the 13th. But they know it. If all the facts and records pertaining to that room were available, they would tell an amazing story, one more uncomfortable than your readers might enjoy. I should guess, for example, that every hotel in New York has had its suicides, but I would be willing to wager my life that only in the Dolphin have there been a dozen of them in a single room. And leaving Celeste Romandeau aside, what about the natural deaths in 1408? The so-called natural deaths?
How many have there been? The idea of so-called natural deaths in 1408 had never occurred to him.
30, Olin replied. 30 at least. 30 that I know of.
You're lying. The words were out of his mouth before he could call them back.
No, Mr. Ensslin, I assure you I'm not. Did you really think that we keep that room empty just out of some vapid old wives' superstition or ridiculous New York tradition? The idea, maybe, that every fine old hotel should have at least one unquiet spirit clanking around in the suite of invisible chains.
Mike Ensslin realized that just such an idea, not articulated but there just the same, had indeed been hanging around his new 10 Nights book, To hear Olin scoff at it in the irritated tones of a scientist scoffing at a brouhaha waving native did nothing to soothe his chagrin.
We have our superstitions and traditions in the hotel trade, but we don't let them get in the way of our business, Mr. Ensslin. There's an old saying in the Midwest, where I broke into the business. There are no drafty rooms when the cattlemen are in town. If we have empties, we fill them. The only exception to that room I have ever made, and the only talk like this I have ever had, is on account of room 1408, a room on the 13th floor, whose very numerals add up to 13.
Olin looked levelly at Mike Ensslin.
It is a room not only of suicides, but of strokes and heart attacks and epileptic seizures. One man who stayed in that room, this was in 1973, apparently drowned in a bowl of soup. You would undoubtedly call that ridiculous, but I spoke to the man who was head of the hotel security at that time, and he saw the death certificate. The power of whatever inhabits the room seems to be less around midday, which is when the room turns always occur, and yet I know of several maids who have turned that room who now suffer from heart problems, emphysema, diabetes. There was a heating problem on that floor 3 years ago, and Mr. Neal, the head maintenance engineer at that time, had to go into several of the rooms to check the heating units. 1408 was one of them. He seemed fine then, both in the room and later on. But he died the following afternoon of a massive cerebral hemorrhage.
Coincidence, Mike said. Yet he could not deny that Olin was good. Had the man been a camp counselor, he would have scared 90% of the kiddies back home after the first round of campfire ghost stories.
Coincidence,
Olin repeated softly, not quite contemptuously. He held out the old-fashioned key on its old-fashioned brass paddle.
How is your own heart, Mr. Ensslin? Not to mention your blood pressure and psychological condition.
Mike found it took an actual, conscious effort to lift his hand. But once he got it moving, it was fine. It rose to the key without even the minutest trembling at the fingertips, so far as he could see. All fine, he said, grasping the worn brass paddle. Besides, I'm wearing my lucky Hawaiian shirt. Olin insisted on accompanying Mike to the 14th floor in the elevator. Mike did not demur. He was interested to see that once they were out of the manager's office and walking down the hall, which led to the elevators, the man reverted to his less consequential self. He became once again poor Mr. Olin, the flunky who had fallen into the writer's clutches. A man in a tux, Mike guessed he was either the restaurant manager or the maitre d', stopped them, offered Olin a thin sheaf of papers, and murmured to him in French. Olin murmured back, nodding, and quickly scribbled his signature on the sheets. The fellow in the bar was now playing Autumn in New York. From this distance, it had an echoey sound, like music heard in a dream. The man in the tuxedo said, "Merci bien," but in a French accent, and went on his way. Mike and the hotel manager went on theirs. Olin again asked if he could carry Mike's little valise, and Mike again refused. In the elevator, Mike found his eyes drawn to the neat triple row of buttons. Everything was where it should have been. There were no gaps, and yet if you looked more closely, you saw that there was. The button marked 12 was followed by one marked 14. As if, Mike thought, they could make the number non-existent by omitting it from the control panel of an elevator. Foolishness. And yet Olin was right. It was done all over the world. As the car rose, Mike said, I'm curious about something. Why didn't you simply create a fictional resident for room 1408? I mean, if it scares you all as badly as you say it does, for that matter, Mr. Olin, why not declare it as your own residence?
I suppose I was afraid I would be accused of fraud, if not by the people responsible for enforcing state and federal civil rights statutes. Hotel people feel about civil rights laws as many of your readers probably feel about clanking chains in the night. Then by my bosses if they got wind of it. If I couldn't persuade you to stay out of 1408, I doubt that I would have much luck in convincing the Stanley Corporation's board of directors that I took a perfectly good room off the market because I was afraid that spooks caused the occasional traveling salesman to jump out the window and splatter himself all over 61st Street.
Mike found this the most disturbing thing Olin had said yet. Because he's not trying to convince me anymore, he thought. Whatever salesmanship powers he had in his office, maybe it's some vibe that comes from the Persian rug. He loses it out here. Competency, yes. You could see that when he was signing the maitre d's sheets. But not salesmanship. Not personal magnetism. Not out here. But he believes it. He believes it all. Above the door, the illuminated 12 went out and the 14 came on. The elevator stopped. The door slid open to reveal a perfectly ordinary hotel corridor with a red and gold carpet, most definitely not a Persian, and electric fixtures that looked like 19th century gas lights.
Here we are, Olin said. Your floor. You'll pardon me if I leave you here. 1408 is to your left, at the end of the hall. Unless I absolutely have to, I don't go any closer than this.
Mike Enslin stepped out of the elevator on legs that seemed heavier than they should have. He turned back to Olin, a pudgy little man in a black coat and a carefully knotted wine-colored tie. Olin's manicured hands were clasped behind him now, and Mike saw that the little man's face was as pale as cream. On his high, lineless forehead, drops of perspiration stood out.
There's a telephone in the room, of course, Olin said. You could try it if you find yourself in trouble, but I doubt that it will work. Not if the room doesn't want it to.
Mike thought of a light reply, something about how that would save him a room service charge at least, but all at once his tongue seemed as heavy as his legs. It just lay there on the floor of his mouth. Olin brought one hand out from behind his back, and Mike saw it was trembling.
Mr. Enslin, he said. Mike, don't do this. For God's sake.
Before he could finish, the elevator door slid shut, cutting him off. Mike stood where he was for a moment in the perfect New York hotel silence of what no one on the staff would admit was the 13th floor of the Hotel Dolphin, and thought of reaching out and pushing the elevator's call button. Except if he did that, Olin would win. And there would be a large, gaping hole where the best chapter of his book should have been. The readers might not know it. His editor and his agent might not know it. Robertson the lawyer might not. But he would. Instead of pushing the call button, he reached up and touched the cigarette behind his ear. That old distracted gesture he no longer knew he was making, and flicked the collar of his lucky shirt. Then he started down the hallway toward 1408, swinging his overnight case by his side. Two. The most interesting artifact left in the wake of Michael Insland's brief stay. It lasted about 70 minutes. In room 1408 was the 11 minutes of recorded tape in his mini-corder, which was charred a bit, but not even close to destroyed. The fascinating thing about the narration was how little narration there was, and how odd it became. The mini-corder had been a present from his ex-wife, with whom he had remained friendly 5 years before, on his first case expedition, the Reelsby farm in Kansas. He had taken it almost as an afterthought, along with 5 yellow legal pads and a leather case filled with sharpened pencils. By the time he reached the door of room 1408 in the Hotel Dolphin 3 books later, he came with a single pen and notebook, plus 5 fresh 90-minute cassettes, in addition to the one he had loaded into the machine before leaving his apartment. He had discovered that narration served him better than note-taking. He was able to catch anecdotes, some of them pretty damn great, as they happened. The bats that had dive-bombed him in the supposedly haunted tower of Gartsby Castle, for instance. He had shrieked like a girl on her first trip through a carny haunted house. Friends hearing this were invariably amused. The little tape recorder was more practical than written notes too, especially when they were in a chilly New Brunswick graveyard and a squall of rain and wind collapsed your tent at 3 a.m. You couldn't take very successful notes in such circumstances, but you could talk. Which was what Mike had done, gone on talking as he struggled out of the wet, flapping canvas of his tent, never losing sight of the mini-corder's comforting red eye. Over the years and the case expeditions, the Sony mini-corder had become his friend. He had never recorded a first-hand account of a true supernatural event on the filament-thin ribbon of a tape running between its reels, and that included the broken comments he made while in 1408, but it was probably not surprising that he had arrived at such feelings of affection for the gadget. Long-haul truckers come to love their Kenworths and Jimmy Petes. Writers treasure a certain pen or battered old typewriter. Professional cleaning ladies are loath to give up the old Electrolux. Mike had never had to stand up to an actual ghost or psychokinetic event with only the mini-corder, his version of a cross and a bunch of garlic, to protect him. But it had been there on plenty of cold, uncomfortable nights. He was hard-headed, but that didn't make him inhuman. His problems with 1408 started even before he got into the room. The door was crooked. Not by a lot, but it was crooked. Canted just the tiniest bit to the left. It made him think first of scary movies where the director tried to indicate mental distress in one of the characters by tipping the camera on point-of-view shots. This association was followed by another one. The way doors looked when you were on a boat and the weather was a little heavy. Back and forth they went. Right and left they went. Tick and tock they went. Until you started to feel a bit woozy in your head and stomach. Not that he felt that way himself, not at all, but yes, I do. Just a little. And he would say so, too. If only because of Olin's insinuation that his attitude made it impossible for him to be fair in the undoubtedly subjective field of spook journalism. He bent over, aware that the slightly woozy feeling in his stomach left as soon as he was no longer looking at that subtly off-kilter door. Unzipped the pocket of his overnighter and took out his mini-corder. He pushed record as he straightened up, saw the little red eye go on, and opened his mouth to say, The door of room 1408 offers its own unique greeting. It appears to have been set crooked, tipped slightly to the left. He said the door, and that's all. If you listen to the tape, you can hear both words clearly, the door, and then the click of the stop button, because the door wasn't crooked. It was perfectly straight. Mike turned, looked at the door of 1409 across the hall, then back at the door of 1408. Both doors were the same, white with gold number plaques and gold doorknobs, both perfectly straight. Mike bent, picked up his overnight case with a hand holding the mini-quarter, moved his key in his other hand toward the lock, then stopped again. The door was crooked again. This time it tilted slightly to the right. "This is ridiculous," Mike murmured. But that woozy feeling had already started in his stomach again. It wasn't just like seasickness. It was seasickness. He had crossed to England on the QE2 a couple of years ago, and one night had been extremely rough. What Mike remembered most clearly was lying on the bed of his stateroom, always on the verge of throwing up but never quite able to do it, and how the feeling of nauseated vertigo got worse if you looked at a doorway or table or a chair, and how they would go back and forth, right and left, tick and tock. This is Olin's fault, he thought. Exactly what he wants. He built you up for it, buddy. He set you up for it. Man, how he'd laugh if he could see you His thoughts broke off as he realized Olin very likely could see him. Mike looked back down the corridor toward the elevator, barely noticing that the slightly whoopsie feeling in his stomach left the moment he stopped staring at the door. Above and to the left of the elevators, he saw what he had expected, a closed-circuit camera. One of the house dicks might be looking at it this very moment. Mike was willing to bet that Olin was right there with him, both of them grinning like apes. Teach him to come in here and start throwing his weight and his lawyer around. Look at him. White as a ghost himself. And he hasn't even touched the key to the lock yet. You got him, boss. You got him hook, line, and sinker. Damned if you do, Mike thought. I stayed in the Rilsby house. Slept in the room where at least 2 of them were killed. And I did sleep. Whether you believe it or not, I spent a night right next to Jeffrey Dahmer's grave. And another 2 stones over from H.P. Lovecraft's. I brushed my teeth next to the tub where Sir David Smith supposedly drowned both of his wives. I stopped being scared of campfire stories a long time ago. I'll be damned if you do. He looked back at the door, and the door was straight. He grunted, pushed the key into the lock, and turned it. The door opened. Mike stepped in. The door did not swing slowly shut behind him as he felt for the light switch, leaving him in total darkness. Besides, the lights of the apartment building next door shone through the window. He found the switch. When he flicked it, the overhead light enclosed in a collection of dangling crystal ornaments came on. So did the standing lamp by the desk on the far side of the room. The window was above the desk, so someone sitting there writing could pause in his work and look out on 61st Street. Or jump out on 61st if the urge so took him, except Mike set down his bag just inside the door, closed the door, and pushed record again. The little red light went on. According to Olin, 6 people have jumped from the window I'm looking at, he said. I won't be taking any dives from the 13th floor of the Hotel Dolphin tonight. There's an iron or steel mesh grill over the outside. Better safe than sorry. 1408 is what you'd call a junior suite, I guess. The room I'm in has 2 chairs, a sofa, and a writing desk. cabinet that probably contains a TV and maybe a minibar. Carpet on the floor is unremarkable. Not a patch on Olin's, believe me. Wallpaper, ditto. Wait. At this point, the listener hears another click on the tape as Mike hits the stop button again. All the scant narration on the tape has that same fragmentary quality, which is utterly unlike the other 150 or so tapes in his literary agent's possession. In addition, his voice grows steadily more distracted. It is not the voice of a man at work, but of a perplexed individual who has begun talking to himself without realizing it. The elliptical nature of the tapes and that growing verbal distraction combine to give most listeners a distinct feeling of unease. Many ask that the tape be turned off long before the end is reached. Mere words on a page cannot adequately convey a listener's growing conviction that he's hearing a man lose, if not his mind, then his hold on conventional reality. But even the flat words themselves suggest that something was happening. What Mike had noticed at that point were the pictures on the walls. There were 3 of them: a lady in 20s style evening dress standing on a staircase, a sailing ship done in the fashion of Currier and Ives, and a still life of fruit. The latter painted with an unpleasant yellow-orange cast to the apples, as well as the oranges and bananas. All 3 pictures were in glass frames, and all 3 were crooked. He had been about to mention the crookedness on tape, but what was so unusual, so worthy of comment, about 3 off-kilter pictures? That a door should be crooked, well, that had a little of that old Cabinet of Dr. Caligari charm. But the door hadn't been crooked. His eyes had tricked him for the moment, that's all. The lady on the stairs tilted left. So did the sailing ship, which showed bell-bottom British tars lining the rail to watch a school of flying fish. The yellowish-orange fruit, to Mike it looked like a bowl of fruit, painted by the light of a suffocating equatorial sun, a Paul Bowles desert sun, tilted to the right. Although he was not ordinarily a fussy man, he circled the room, setting them straight. Looking at them crooked like that was making him feel a touch nauseated again. He wasn't entirely surprised either. One grew susceptible to the feeling. He had discovered that on the QE2, he had been told that if one persevered through that period of increased susceptibility, one usually adapted. Got your sea legs, some of the old hands still said. Mike hadn't done enough sailing to get his sea legs, nor cared to. These days he stuck with his land legs, and if straightening the 3 pictures in the unremarkable sitting room 1408 would settle his midsection, good for him. There was dust on the glass covering the pictures. He trailed his fingers across the still life and left 2 parallel streaks. The dust had a greasy, slippery feel, like silk just before it rots, was what came into his mind. But he was damned if he was going to put that on tape. How was he supposed to know what silk felt like just before it rotted? It was a drunk's thought. When the pictures were set to rights, he stepped back and surveyed them in turn. The evening-dressed lady by the door leading into the bedroom, the ship plying one of the 7 seas to the left of the writing desk. Finally, the nasty, and quite badly painted, fruit by the TV cabinet. Part of him expected that they would be crooked again, or fall crooked as he looked at them. That was the way things happened in movies like House on Haunted Hill and in old episodes of The Twilight Zone. But the pictures remained perfectly straight, as he had fixed them. Not, he told himself, that he would have found anything supernatural or paranormal and returned to their former crooked state. In his experience, reversion was the nature of things. People who had given up smoking, he touched a cigarette cocked behind his ear without being aware of it, wanted to go on smoking. And pictures that had been hanging crooked since Nixon was president wanted to go on being crooked. And they've been here a long time, no doubt about that, Mike thought. And if I lift them away from the walls, I'd see lighter patches on the wallpaper, or bugs squirming out, the way they do when you turn over a rock. There was something both shocking and nasty about this idea. It came with a vivid image of blind white bugs oozing out of the pale and formerly protected wallpaper like living pus. Mike raised the mini-recorder, pushed record, and said, Olin has certainly started a train of thought in my head. Or chain of thought, which was it? He set out to give me the heebie-jeebies, and he certainly succeeded. I don't mean... Didn't mean what? To be racist? Was heebie-jeebies short for Hebrew jeebies? That was ridiculous. That would be Hebrew jeebrews. A phrase which was meaningless. On the tape at this point, flat and perfectly articulated, Mike Insland says, I've got to get a hold of myself right now. This is followed by another click as he shuts the tape off again. He closed his eyes and took 4 long measured breaths, holding each one into a 5 count before letting it out again. Nothing like this had ever happened to him, not in the supposedly haunted houses, the supposedly haunted graveyards, or the supposedly haunted castles. This wasn't like being haunted, or what he imagined being haunted would be like. This was like being stoned on bad, cheap dope. Olin did this. Olin hypnotized you. You're going to break out of it. You're going to spend the goddamn night in this room. Not just because it's the best location you've ever been in. Leave out Olin, and you got damn near enough for the ghost story of the decade already. But because Olin doesn't get to win. Him and his bullshit story, wow, 30 people have died in here. They don't get to win. I'm the one in charge of bullshit around here. So just breathe in and out. Breathe in and out. And out. He went on like that for nearly 90 seconds. And when he opened his eyes again, he felt normal. The pictures on the wall, still straight. Fruit in the bowl, still yellow-orange and uglier than ever. Dessert fruit for sure. Eat one piece of that and you'd shit until it hurt. He pushed record. The red eye went on. I had a little vertigo for a minute or two, he said, crossing the room to the writing desk and the window with its protective mesh outside. It might have been a hangover from Olin's yarning, but I could believe I feel a genuine presence here. He felt no such thing, of course, but once that was on tape, he could write almost anything he pleased. The air is stale. Not musty or foul-smelling. Olin said the place gets aired out every time it gets turned, but the turns are quick and... yeah... it's stale. Hey, look at this. There was an ashtray on the writing desk, one of those little ones made of thick glass that you could use in hotels, or you used to see in hotels everywhere. And in it was a book of matches. On the front was a hotel dolphin. In front of the hotel stood a smiling doorman in very old-fashioned uniform, the kind with shoulder boards, gold frogging, and a cap that looked as if it belonged in a gay bar, perched on the head of a motorcycle ramrod, wearing nothing else but a few silver body rings. Going back and forth on Fifth Avenue in front of the hotel were cars from another era, Packards and Hudsons, Studebakers and Finney Chrysler New Yorkers. The matchbook in this ashtray looks like it comes from about 1955, Mike said, and slipped it into the pocket of his lucky Hawaiian shirt. I'm keeping it as a souvenir. Now it's time for a little fresh air. There is a clunk as he sets the mini-quarter down, presumably on the writing desk. There is a pause, followed by vague sounds and a couple of effortful grunts. Oi. After these come a second pause and then a squeaking sound. Success, he says. This is a little off mic, but the follow-up is closer. Success. Mike repeated, picking up the mini-quarter off the desk. Bottom half wouldn't budge. It's like it's nailed shut. But that top half came down all right. I can hear the traffic on Fifth Avenue, and all the beeping horns have a comforting quality. Someone's playing a saxophone, perhaps in front of the plaza, which is across the street 2 blocks down. It reminds me of my brother. Mike stopped abruptly, looking out the little red eye. It seemed to accuse him. Brother? His brother was dead, another fallen soldier in the tobacco wars. Then he relaxed. What of it? These were the spook wars, where Michael Insland had always come off the winner. As for Donald Insland... My brother was actually eaten by wolves one winter on the Connecticut Turnpike, he said, then laughed and pushed stop. There's more on the tape, a little more. But that's the final statement of any coherence. Final statement, that is, to which a clear meaning can be ascribed. Mike turned on his heels and looked at the pictures, still hanging perfectly straight. Good little pictures that they were. That still life, though, what an ugly fucking thing that was. He pushed record and spoke 2 words. Fuming oranges. Into the mini-quarter. Then he turned it off again and walked across the room to the door leading to the bedroom. He paused by the evening dress lady and reached into the darkness, feeling for the light switch. He had just 1 moment to register. It feels like skin. Like old dead skin. Something wrong with the wallpaper under his sliding palm, and then his fingers found the switch. The bedroom was flooded with yellow light from another of those ceiling fixtures buried in hanging glass baubles. The bed was a double hiding under a yellow-orange coverlet. Why say hiding? Mike asked the mini-quarter, then pushed the stop button again. He stepped in, fascinated by the fuming desert of the coverlet, by the tumorous bulges of the pillows beneath it. Sleep there? Not at all, sir. It would be like sleeping inside the goddamn still life, sleeping in that horrible hot Paul Bowles room you couldn't quite see, a room for lunatic expatriate Englishmen who were blind from syphilis, caught while fucking their mothers. The film version starring either Lawrence Harvey or Jeremy Irons, one of those actors you just naturally associated with unnatural acts. Mike pushed record. Little Red Eye came on. He said, Orpheus on the Orpheum Circuit, into the mic, then pushed stop again. He approached the bed. The coverlet gleamed yellow-orange. The wallpaper, perhaps cream-colored by daylight, had picked up the yellow-orange glow of the coverlet. There was a little night table to either side of the bed. On one was a telephone, black and large and equipped with a dial. The finger holes in the dial looked like surprised white eyes. On the other table was a dish with a plum in it. Mike pushed record and said, That isn't a real plum. It's a plastic plum. He pushed stop again. On the bed itself was a doorknob menu. Mike sidled up on the side of the bed, being quite careful to touch neither the bed nor the wall, and picked the menu up. He tried not to touch the coverlet either, but the tips of his fingers brushed it and he moaned. It was soft in some terrible wrong way. Nevertheless, he picked the menu up. It was in French, and although it had been years since he had taken the language, one of the breakfast items appeared to be birds roasted in shit. That at least sounds like something the French might eat, he thought, and uttered a wild, distracted laugh. He closed his eyes and opened them. The menu was in Russian. He closed his eyes and opened them. The menu was in Italian. Closed his eyes, opened them. There was no menu. There was a picture of a screaming little woodcut boy looking back over his shoulder at the woodcut wolf, which had swallowed his left leg up to the knee. The wolf's ears were laid back, and he looked like a terrier with its favorite toy. I don't see that, Mike thought, and of course he didn't. Without closing his eyes, he saw neat lines of English, each line listing a different breakfast temptation. Eggs, waffles, fresh berries. No birds roasted in shit. Still... He turned around and very slowly edged himself out of the little space between the wall and the bed, a space that now felt as narrow as a grave. His heart was beating so hard that he could feel it in his neck and wrists as well as in his chest. His eyes were throbbing in their sockets. 1408 was wrong, yes indeed. 1408 was very wrong. Olin had said something about poison gas, and that was when Mike felt like that was what he felt like. Someone who had been gassed or forced to smoke strong hashish laced with insect poison. Olin had done this, of course, probably with the active, laughing connivance of the security people, pumped his special poison gas up through the vents. Just because he could see no vents didn't mean the vents were not there. Mike looked around the bedroom with wide, frightened eyes. There was no plum on the end table to the left of the bed, no plate either. The table was bare. He turned, started for the door, leading back to the sitting room, and stopped. There was a picture on the wall. He couldn't be absolutely sure. In his present state, he couldn't be absolutely sure of his own name. But he was fairly sure that there had been no picture there when he first came in. It was a still life. A single plum sat on a tin plate in the middle of an old plank table. The light falling across the plum and the plate was a feverish yellow-orange. Tango light, he thought. The kind of light that makes the dead get up out of their graves and tango. The kind of light... I have to get out of here, he whispered, and blundered back into the sitting room. He became aware that his shoes had begun to make odd smooching sounds, as if the floor beneath them were growing soft. The pictures on the living room wall were crooked again, and there were other changes as well. The lady on the stairs had pulled down the top of her gown, baring her breasts. She held one in each hand. A drop of blood hung from each nipple. She was staring directly into Mike's eyes and grinning ferociously. Her teeth were filed to cannibal points. At the rail of the sailing ship, the stars had been replaced by a line of pallid men and women. The man on the far left, nearest the ship's bow, wore a brown wool suit and held a derby hat in one hand. His hair was slicked to his brow and parted in the middle. His face was shocked and vacant. Mike knew his name. Kevin O'Malley, this room's first occupant. A sewing machine salesman who had jumped from his room in October of 1910. To O'Malley's left were the others who had died here, all with that same vacant, shocked expression. It made them look related. All members of the same inbred and cataclysmically retarded family. In the picture where the fruit had been, there was now a severed human head. Yellow-orange light swam off the sunken cheeks, the sagging lips, the upturned glazing eyes, the cigarette parked behind the right ear. Mike blundered toward the door, his feet smooching and now actually seeming to stick a little at each step. The door wouldn't open, of course. The chain hung unengaged, and the thumb bolt stood straight up, like clock hands pointing to 6 o'clock, but the door would not open. Breathing rapidly, Mike turned from it and waded. That was what it felt like. Across the room to the writing desk. He could see the curtains beside the window he had cracked open, waving desultorily. But he could feel no fresh air against his face. It was as though the room were swallowing it. He could still hear horns on Fifth, but they were now very distant. Did he still hear the saxophone? If so, the room had stolen its sweetness and melody and left only an atonal, reedy drone, like the wind blowing across a hole in a dead man's neck, or a pop bottle filled with severed fingers, or "Stop it," he tried to say, but he could no longer speak. His heart was hammering at a terrible pace. If it went on much faster, it would explode. His mini-quarter, faithful companion of many case expeditions, was no longer in his hand. He had left it somewhere. In the bedroom? If it was in the bedroom, it's probably gone by now, swallowed by the room. When it was digested, it would be excreted into one of the pictures. Gasping for breath like a runner nearing the end of a long race, Mike put a hand to his chest, as if to soothe his heart. What he felt in the left breast pocket of his gaudy shirt was the small square shape of the mini-quarter. The feel of it, so solid and known, steadied him a little, brought him back a little. He became aware that he was humming, and that the room seemed to be humming back at him, as if myriad mouths were concealed beneath its smoothly nasty wallpaper. He was aware that his stomach was now so nauseated that it seemed to be swinging in its own greasy hammock. He could feel the air crowding against his ears in soft, coagulating clots, and it made him think of how fudge was when it reached the softball stage. But he was back a little, enough to be positive of one thing. He had to call for help while there was still time. The thought of Olin smirking in his deferential New York hotel manager way and saying "I told you so" didn't bother him, and the idea that Olin had somehow induced these strange perceptions and horrible fear by chemical means had entirely left his mind. It was the room. It was the goddamned room. He meant to jab out a hand to the old-fashioned telephone, the twin of the one in the bedroom, and snatch it up. Instead, he watched his arm descend to the table in a kind of delirious slow motion, so like the arm of a diver he almost expected to see bubbles rising from it. He closed his fingers around the handset and picked it up. His other hand dove, as deliberate as the first, and dialed 0. As he put the headset of the phone against his ear, he heard a series of clicks as the dial spun back to its original position. It sounded like the wheel on Wheel of Fortune. Do you want to spin or do you want to solve the puzzle? Remember that if you try to solve the puzzle and fail, you will be put out into the snow beside the Connecticut Turnpike, and the wolves will eat you. There was no ring in his ear. Instead, a harsh voice simply began speaking.
This is 9. 9. This is 9. 9. This is 10. 10. We have killed your friends. Every friend is now dead. This is 6. 6.
Mike listened with growing horror. not at what the voice was saying, but at its rasping emptiness. It was not a machine-generated voice, but it wasn't a human voice either. It was the voice of the room. The presence pouring out of the walls and the floor, the presence speaking to him from the telephone, had nothing in common with any haunting or paranormal event he had ever read about. There was something alien here. No, not here yet. But coming. It's hungry. And your dinner. The phone fell from his relaxing fingers and he turned around. It swung at the end of its cord the way his stomach was swinging back and forth inside him. He could still hear that voice rasping out of the back.
18. This is now 18. Take cover when the siren sounds. This is 4. 4.
He was not aware of taking the cigarette from behind his ear and putting it in his mouth, or of fumbling the book of matches with the old-fashioned gold frog doorman on it out of his bright shirt's right breast pocket, not aware that, after 9 years, he had finally decided to have a smoke. Before him, the room had begun to melt. It was sagging out of its right angles and straight lines, not into curves, but into strange Moorish arcs that hurt his eyes. The glass chandelier in the center of the ceiling began to sag like a thick glob of spit. The pictures began to bend, turning into shapes like the windshields of old cars. From behind the glass of the picture of the door leading into the bathroom, the 20s women with the bleeding nipples and grinning cannibal teeth whirled around and ran back up the stairs, going with a jerky, delirious high-knee pistoning of a vamp in a silent movie. The telephone continued to grind and spit, the voice coming from it now the voice of an electric hair clipper that has learned how to talk.
5. This is 5. Ignore the siren. Even if you leave this room, you can never leave this room. 8. This is 8.
The door to the bedroom and the door to the hall had begun to collapse downward, widening in the middle and becoming doorways for beings possessed of unhallowed shapes. The light began to grow bright and hot, filling the room with that yellow-orange glow. Now he could see rips in the wallpaper, black pores that quickly grew to become mouths. The floor sank into a concave arc, and now he could hear it coming. The dweller in the room behind the room, the thing in the walls, the owner of the buzzing voice.
6.
The phone screamed.
6. This is 6. This is goddamn fucking 6.
He looked down at the matchbook in his hand. The one he had plucked out from the bedroom ashtray. Funny old doorman, funny old cars, with their big chrome grills, and words running across the bottom that he had not seen in a long time, because now the strip of abrasive stuff was always on the back. Close cover before striking. Without thinking about it, he no longer could think. Mike Ensslin tore out a single match, allowing the cigarette to drop out of his mouth at the same time. He struck the match and immediately touched it to the others in the book. There was a sound, a strong whiff of burning sulfur that went into his head like a whiff of smelling salts, and a bright flare of match heads. And again, without so much as a single thought, Mike held the flaring bouquet of fire against the front of his shirt. It was a cheap thing made in Korea or Cambodia or Borneo, old now. It caught fire at once, before the flames could blaze up in front of his eyes, rendering the room once more unstable. Mike saw it clearly, like a man who has awakened from a nightmare only to find the nightmare all around him. His head was clear. The strong whiff of sulfur and the sudden rising heat from his shirt had done that much, but the room maintained its insanely Moorish aspect. Moorish was wrong, not even very close, but it was the only word that seemed even to reach toward what had happened here, what was still happening. He was in a melting, rotting cave full of swoops and mad tilts. The door to the bedroom had become the door to some sarcophagal inner chamber, and to his left, where the picture of the fruit had been, the wall was bulging outward toward him, splitting open in those long cracks that gaped like mouths, opening on a world from which something was now approaching. Mike Ensslin could hear its slobbering, avid breath, and smell something alive and dangerous. It smelled a little like the lion house in the... Thin flames scorched the undershelf of his chin, banishing thought. The heat rising from his blazing shirt put that waver back into the world, and as he began to smell the crispy aroma of his chest hair starting to fry, Mike again bolted across the sagging rug to the hall door. An insectile buzzing sound had begun to sweat out of the walls. The yellow-orange light was steadily brightening, as if a hand were turning up an invisible rheostat. But this time, when he reached the door and turned the knob, the door opened. It was as if the thing behind the bulging wall had no use for a burning man, did not perhaps relish cooked meat. Three. This is 3. A popular song from the 50s suggests that love makes the world go round, but coincidence would probably be a better bet. Rufus Dearborn, who was staying that night in room 1414, up near the elevators, was a salesman for the Singer Sewing Machine Company, in town from Texas to talk about moving up into an executive position. And so it happened that 90 or so years after the room 1408's first occupant jumped to his death, another sewing machine salesman saved the life of the man who had come to write about the purportedly haunted room. Or perhaps that is an exaggeration. Mike Ensslin might have lived even if no one, especially a fellow on his way back from a visit to the ice machine, had been in the hallway at that moment. Having your shirt catch fire is no joke, though, and he certainly would have been burned much more severely and extensively if not for Dearborn, who thought fast and moved even faster. Not that Dearborn ever remembered exactly what happened. He constructed a coherent enough story for the newspapers and TV cameras. He liked the idea of being a hero very much, and it certainly did no harm to his executive aspirations. And he clearly remembered seeing the man on fire lunge out into the hall, but after that, everything was a blur. Thinking about it was like trying to reconstruct the things you had done during the vilest, deepest drunk of your life. One thing he was sure of, but didn't tell any of the reporters because it made no sense. The Burning Man's scream seemed to grow in volume, as if he were a stereo that was being turned up. He was right there in front of Dearborn, and the pitch of the scream never changed, but the volume most certainly did. It was as if the man were some incredibly loud object that was just arriving here. Dearborn ran down the hall with the full ice bucket in his hand. The Burning Man, it was just his shirt on fire. I saw that right away, he told the reporters. Struck the door opposite the room he had come out of, rebounded, staggered, and fell to his knees. That was when Dearborn reached him. He put his foot on the burning shoulder of the screaming man's shirt and pushed him over onto the hall carpet. Then he dumped the contents of the ice bucket onto him. These things were blurred in his memory but accessible. He was aware that the burning shirt seemed to be casting far too much light, a sweltering yellow-orange light, that made him think of a trip he and his brother had made to Australia 2 years before. They had rented an all-wheel drive and had taken off across the Great Australian Desert. The few natives called it the Great Australian Bugger-All, the Dearborn brothers discovered. A hell of a trip, great, but spooky. Especially the big rock in the middle, Ayers Rock. They had reached it right around sunset, and the light on its man faces was like this, hot and strange. Not really what you thought of as Earthlight at all. He dropped beside the burning man, who was now only the smoldering man, the covered with ice cubes man, and rolled him over to stifle the flames reaching around to the back of the shirt. When he did, he saw the skin on the left of the man's neck had gone a smoky, bubbly red, and the lobe of his ear on that side had melted a little, but otherwise... Dearborn looked up, and it seemed... This was crazy, but it seemed the door to the room the man had come out of was filled with the burning light of the Australian sundown, the hot light of an empty place where things no man had ever seen might live. It was terrible, that light, and the low buzzing like an electric clipper was trying desperately to speak, but it was fascinating, too. He wanted to go into it. He wanted to see what was behind it. Perhaps Mike saved Dearborn's life as well. He was certainly aware that Dearborn was getting up, as if Mike no longer held any interest for him, and that his face was filled with the blazing, pulsing light coming out of 1408. He remembered this better than Dearborn later did himself, but of course Rufe Dearborn had not been reduced to setting himself on fire in order to survive. Mike grabbed the cuff of Dearborn's slacks. "Don't go in there," he said in a cracked, smoky voice. "You'll never come out." Dearborn stopped, looking down at the reddening, blistering face of the man on the carpet. "It's haunted," Mike said, as if the word had been a talisman. The door of room 1408 slammed furiously shut, cutting off the light, cutting off the terrible buzz that was almost words. Rufus Dearborn, one of the Singer sewing machine's finest, ran down to the elevators and pulled the fire alarm. 4. This is 4. There's an interesting picture of Mike Insulan in Treating the Burn Victim, a Diagnostic Approach. The 16th edition of which appeared about 16 months after Mike's short stay in room 1408 of the Hotel Dauphin. The photo shows just his torso, but it's Mike all right. One can tell by the white square on the left side of his chest. The flesh all around it is an angry red, actually blistered into second-degree burns in some places. The white square marks the left breast pocket of the shirt he was wearing that night, the lucky shirt, with his mini-quarter in the pocket. The mini-quarter itself melted around the corners, but it still works, and the tape inside it was fine. It's the things on it which are not fine. After listening to it 3 or 4 times, Mike's agent Sam Farrell tossed it into his wall safe, refusing to acknowledge the goose flesh all over his tan, scrawny arms. In that wall safe, the tape has stayed ever since. Farrell has no urge to take it out and play it again. Not for himself, not for his curious friends, some of whom would cheerfully kill to hear it. New York publishing is a small community, and word gets around. He doesn't like Mike's voice on the tape. He doesn't like the stuff that voice is saying. "My brother was actually eaten by wolves one winter on the Connecticut Turnpike." What in God's name was that supposed to mean? And most of all, he doesn't like the background sounds on the tape, a kind of liquid smooshing that sometimes sounds like clothes churning around in an overused, oversudsed washer. Sometimes like one of those old electric hair clippers, and sometimes weirdly like a voice. While Mike was still in the hospital, a man named Olin, the manager of the goddamn hotel if you please, came and asked Sam Farrell if he could listen to that tape. Farrell said no, he couldn't. What Olin could do was take himself on out of the agent's office at a rapid hike, thank God all the way back to the flea bag where he worked, and that Mike Insulan had decided not to sue either the hotel or Olin for negligence. "I tried to persuade him not to go in," Olin said quietly. A man who spent most of his working days listening to tired travelers and petulant guests bitch about everything from their rooms to the magazine selection in the newsstand. He wasn't much perturbed by Farrell's rancor. "I tried everything in my power. If anyone was negligent that night, Mr. Farrell, it was your client. He believed too much in nothing. Very unwise behavior. Very unsafe behavior. I would guess he has changed somewhat in that regard." In spite of Farrell's distaste for the tape, he would like Mike to listen to it, acknowledge it, perhaps use it as a pad from which to launch a new book. There is a book in What Happened to Mike, Farrell knows it. Not just a chapter, a 40-page case history, but an entire book. one that might outsell all 3 of the 10 Knights books combined. And of course he doesn't believe Mike's assertion that he is finished not only with ghost tales, but with all writing. Writers say that from time to time, that's all. The occasional prima donna outburst is part of what makes writers in the first place. As for Mike Enslin himself, he got lucky, all things considered. And he knows it. He could have been burned much more badly than he actually was. If not for Mr. Dearborn and his bucket of ice, he might have had 20 or even 30 different skin graft procedures to suffer through instead of only 4. His neck is scarred on the left side in spite of the grafts, but the doctors at the Boston Burn Institute tell him the scars will fade on their own. He also knows that the burns, painful as they were in the weeks and months after that night, were necessary. If not for the matches with "close cover before striking" written on the front, he would have died in 1408, and his end would have been unspeakable. To a coroner, it might have looked like a stroke or a heart attack, but the actual cause of death would have been much nastier. Much nastier. He was also lucky in having produced 3 popular books on ghosts and hauntings before actually running afoul of a place that is haunted. That he also knows. Sam Farrell may not believe Mike's life as a writer is over, but Sam doesn't need to. Mike knows it for both of them. He cannot so much as write a postcard without feeling cold all over his skin and being nauseated deep in the pit of his belly. Sometimes just looking at a pen or a tape recorder will make him think, "The pictures were crooked. I tried to straighten the pictures." He doesn't know what this means. He can't remember the pictures or anything else from room 1408, and he's glad. That's a mercy. His blood pressure isn't so good these days. His doctor told him that burn victims often develop problems with their blood pressure and put him on medication. His eyes trouble him. His ophthalmologist told him to start taking Ocuvite. He had consistent back problems. His prostate has gotten large, but he can deal with these things. He knows he isn't the first person to escape 1408 without really escaping. Olin tried to tell him, but it isn't all bad. At least he doesn't remember. Sometimes he has nightmares, quite often in fact, almost every goddamn night in fact, but he rarely remembers them when he wakes up. A sense that things are rounding off at the corners mostly, melting the way the corners of his mini-quarter melted. He lives on Long Island these days, and when the weather is good, he takes long walks on the beach. The closest he's ever come to articulating what he does remember about his 70-odd, very odd minutes in 1408 was on one of those walks. "It was never human," he told the incoming waves in a choked, halting voice. "Ghosts, at least ghosts were once human. The thing in the wall, though. That thing." Time may improve it. He can and does hope for that. Time may fade it, as it will fade the scars on his neck. In the meantime, though, he sleeps with the lights on in his bedroom, so he will know at once where he is when he wakes up from the bad dreams. He has had all the phones taken out of his house, at some point just below the place where his conscious mind seems able to go. He's afraid of picking up the phone, hearing a buzzing and human voice spit,
This is 9. 9. We have killed your friends. Every friend is now dead.
And when the sun goes down on clear evenings, he pulls every shade and blind and drape in the house. He sits like a man in a dark room until his watch tells him the light, even the last fading glow along the horizon, must be gone. He can't stand the light that comes at sunset. That yellow deepening to orange, like light in the Australian desert.